That's better?
Yeah, it should be in the, no, it's like in the corner where you can see, like, move your browser over a little bit. You can talk, I'll why don't you introduce?
Okay.
Sorry. I don't know if any of you have met or heard of Brian Ford. He is on the core team at Angular, and he is my personal buddy. So he agreed a while ago to do a remote question and answer with us, and we chose router as a topic because that's what he's working on. So, Brian?
Hello, everyone.
Hey. Okay, that's a little loud.
I can see if I can have him keep talking though.
You can introduce yourself.
So Sharon gave a pretty good introduction. I work on the core team at Google on Angular. So I get to do open source full time, which is really exciting. Today I'm going to give just a super short presentation about what I've been up to recently. And then I'm actually going to grab my colleague Rado and the two of them.
Whoa. Okay, we can't both be doing this at the same time.
Am I good still?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sleep.
All right. Okay. So if everything is good on your end, Sharon, I'll just start the screen share. That sound all right? Okay.
We find the
I'm going for it. It's happening. Okay. So again, this is super quick. Jeff gave a great presentation that actually covered a lot of these things. But what's the deal with routing in Angular? I apologize for this picture. It's super low resolution. So I haven't been super vocal lately because I've been very heads down. So this is like the first time that many of these things are being presented in slide form to the outside world. So first thing, it's been renamed. So it's called Component Router now. There's a whole thread about why this needed to happen and all of the details, but the long story short is new router was too confusing of a name, so it's called Component Router now, and the module name is no longer ng new router, it's ng component router. And one of the directives, ng viewport, is now called ng outlet, and this was to avoid a naming collision in Angular 2. Ironically, though, this week, I think the thing that was called viewport in Angular 2, they might have refactored it out. So maybe that name is available again. I don't know. But right now, this is what these things are called. It's very exciting. I've been working mostly on unifying Angular 1 and Angular 2 code in all the same place to kind of rush and meet a bunch of deadlines. I had been working separately on different parts. This is mostly because our infrastructure that compiles TypeScript into JavaScript. We've been doing all sorts of crazy things. Igor has been experimenting with a bunch of build systems, and the idea is to make something on the build layer that works super well for us and then also works really well in the application layer. So in the coming months, you'll probably see more about why this is such a big deal. But the long story short is that all the code now lives in Angular, and for the time being, that's where things will go. And once our infrastructure layer has settled down and can be kind of put into its own module, then the code will live in Angular/router. So it seems confusing and perhaps arbitrary, but there's a good reason for it. And Component Router 1.0 will be soon, in the next couple of weeks, probably. One cool thing that I've been doing at Google is I've helped a couple teams with small apps move on to Component Router for Angular 1, and that's helped prove out a lot of things. There's some coming changes based on feedback from that, but it's really exciting. So it's getting there. Okay, so I wanted to quickly talk about the difference between ng-route and component router for those who have not been following along. There's a lot of words on this slide. So routing in Angular 1 uses a module called ng-route. This is a simple router with basic features. There's also a community module called UI router. UI router is super great, but it was not really designed for Angular 2's view system. But it has a lot of awesome features, and it actually heavily influenced the design of component router. So I saw there was a question about this, and I'm going to try and preemptively answer it. by saying that, yes, there will be some good way to migrate from UI router onto component router. And one of the cool things is that semantically they're really well aligned. And the UI router team, Nate especially, has been very communicative with me and giving me lots of good feedback. So hopefully component router will become like the cool thing to use. So if you're on UI router, do not fret. Like, more interesting work there is coming soon. Okay, so the main API differences that kind of show the semantic differences are in ng-route. You have a config block, and inside of that you call route provider.when. You usually have one of these per app, but you might have multiple different run blocks and compose them together in some crazy way. In component router, you actually annotate controllers, or alternatively, you can build up a more dynamic configuration by calling router.config. Router is just a service. Then in ng-route, your configs all take controllers and templates and controller as and all of these sort of things. In component router, instead, you're basically mapping from a path to a controller, essentially. This slide's perhaps a little bit outdated. The idea, though, is that you have a controller that represents the whole component, and you have an associated template that goes with it. And I'll show a little bit more about that in a bit. And then in ng-route, you have this thing called ng-view. This is where the loaded content gets put into. In component router, in Angular 1, it's called ng-outlet, just to follow along the conventions in Angular 1. But in ng-2, it's called route outlet. Okay, so how does this work? We'll show it in a to-do list application because those are everyone's favorite. So this is what a component router sort of looks like in Angular 2. You would import two different views that you would navigate to. So list component and edit component are both components. Again, you can think of a component as kind of a smashed together directive plus controller plus template. And the idea there is that instead of having a bunch of special case constructs in Angular 2, they're more unified. So the cool thing is that you can essentially route to a component, and you can also use the component as a directive, and this means that you get better portability. So you would use this route config annotation in Angular 2 to say to-do component has a template with this viewport, or not viewport, sorry, with this outlet in it, rather, and inside of there, depending on the path, we're going to put one of two different things. So again, reference to components. The component router and Angular 2, if you're looking at the list component file, it just looks like this, right? So this is just a regular old component. And the important thing to note here is that components own their own template. So we don't have to say, you're loading this controller with this template. You can easily just say, oh, you load this component, and it has both these things smashed together. So semantically, we have to do some work in Angular 1 in order to kind of unify these two concepts to use the component router. But I'll show a little bit more about that in a second. So let's start from the beginning with a to-do list application using ng-route, and we're going to migrate it to component router. All of these examples are Angular 1. So here we have to-do list controller and to-do list HTML, and we have edit item controller and edit item.html. The first thing that we want to do is we want to have a top-level controller that has this annotations on it. So we put these annotations on there. This top-level controller, and here again we have to figure out a way to represent components. So I'll show you how this works, but essentially you have a string that maps from component. This property is a string, and the router maps the string into a controller constructor and into a template. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this depending on where your app is and how you're migrating it. Oh, I actually have this on the next slide. Okay, yeah, so this is the basic version. You can actually set up this component wrapper service to use whatever strategy makes sense for you. So you might have some convention where you say, my component names are just the controller name without the control at the end, and then the name of the associated template is just the component with .html at the end, right? Or maybe you convert things to underscores, or you camel case it, or you make the first letter capital. You might do any of these things. But later, you could, in your list controller, so this is one of the two childs, you could actually use the same style annotation, right? And then in your component mapper, you could say, oh, get a hold of the controller, and then use this controller introspector service, which essentially just does reflection on the controller constructor class. Give me this template URL and return it. So in this way, we're able to use annotations in Angular 1 in a way that's much, much closer to Angular 2. And again, this is cool because you can use whatever strategy makes sense to you. So if you have a huge app and you want to move from ng-route onto component router, it's going to be difficult to take all of your information about templates and move them into each individual file. So you can use the first strategy where you just say, oh, I'm going to set up this convention in that case. Or if you're writing more new code, right? So you're implementing an Angular 1 app using component router, you could use this strategy and you'll be much more semantically aligned. And the cool thing is it's not too bad then to go from Angular 1 all the way to Angular 2 even, right? Because at this point, all of the things are in the right place. You're just moving things around. You might be using the TypeScript semantics, but conceptually things are much closer. So the key thing in the router is there's basically two phases. There's how do we make it so we can run it with existing stuff very well, and then how do we make it so you can take your existing controllers and templates and semantically get them really close to Angular 2. And then once you're there, there's other additional steps that we can ease in this migration path. But at some point, it should be so easy to just rewrite these last little bits, these last little annotations, that you just do it, and suddenly you're on Angular 2. So this is a work in progress, but there's even more awesome work in the pipeline for Angular 1.5. So in Angular 1.5, we want to have this module.component, and this will be kind of a simplified directive syntax, you can think of it as. So this will handle the common case, and you can follow along this issue on GitHub. There's a spec that I've been working on that's not quite in a state that's good to post, but if you follow along there will be a bunch of updates once Angular 4 ships, because we'll be diving right in on 1.5 with the theme of migration. Okay, cool. So now we are ready for Q&A. I'm going to grab Rado because he knows lots of things about Angular 2, and I know lots of things about router, and so together, hopefully we can answer everyone's questions. So 1 second, I'm going to grab him.
Oh. This one. Can you hear me?
No, I heard it over.
All right.
All right, so I just need to stay far away from the computer.
No,
Is that a question?
you have to get close to me. Okay.
This is.
Hey, so hi everyone, this is Rado.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I don't see you, but I'll take Brian's word that there's a group of people on the other end of this.
1 second, I'm gonna make sure this over here is muted.
Don't think it is.
okay. So do we have a question?
You want to try this again?
Can you hear?
Yep, we can hear.
All right, so I'll paraphrase again, that the question online is basically whether it was daunting being the main guy on a project that so many people are interested in.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Can you repeat it?
Whether it was daunting being the only person on a project that so many people are interested in.
You might be okay now.
It's hard to say. So I'm not, in some sense, I'm the only person working on the router, but in other senses, I just grab people whenever I need anything. So the way that we organize work on the team is that really one person should be in charge of design. If you've read, I think Mythical Man Month, there's a bit in there about how every software project should be like a surgical team, right? So it should essentially be one person making design decisions, because then you have a really cohesive, good design, and then all sorts of other people supporting around that or implementing or doing things like that. So for routing, basically, whenever I have an issue with Angular 2, like I come and I find this guy. When I have issues with like, tooling or TypeScript, I go and I ask Martin, or I go ask someone else. And so that's sort of how the team operates. So in one sense, yes, like it's really difficult to come up with a good design for the router. But as far as getting code in and like the mechanical thing of recording stuff, that part's not very difficult at all. It's just a matter of figuring out what the right thing to do is.
Okay, I have a question actually that I thought was brought up earlier, but so you mentioned that the component router is going to have some of the UI router functionality, or there'll be a transition path there. One of the key features of the UI router is the focus on state. So it's doing state transitions, and the concept of a state that is abstracted out from a component. So it's not focused on the component, it's focused on the overall state of the app. So can you talk a little bit about how someone would manage state within the component router, or is that just not something that would be focused on?
Sure. So I avoid use of the term state in the router, but there's a lot of places where if you look at it like a state machine, the router very much so behaves in exactly the same way as the UI router. So one thing to me that's really important and that's unique about UI router is that it takes advantage of this componentized view system in Angular 2. And so because everything in a component is sort of self-contained, the idea is that components can be really reusable. And so you only want to be showing just enough information to that component so that way it can do what it needs to. So what the component router does is it has something that's very similar to this object, but it's called an instruction. And essentially, it'll pass you information at certain points in its lifetime, or in its life cycle, and you can take that information and do with it what you want. But the important thing is that you don't just get a hold of something that changes from all over the place. You only have access to the things that you specifically ask for. And the cool thing is that as a side effect, it just means that you get better code, and your code is easy. So yes, the code is still there, but the implementation is just a little bit different.
So we have a couple questions.
Sure. The first one of the more useful things for me in UI router is the ability to do results, meaning to call the server and to do promises and all that stuff. Only when everything is resolved, then transition into the new state, the new route. Is there something like that planned for the new component router?
Yeah, there's actually a more powerful mechanism called the routing pipeline, and this acts like a series of middleware. And so I'm still working out exactly what the API should look like. In ng route, resolve kind of just let you do a bunch of different things, and people use that for all sorts of things. People use that for authentication. People use that to like hackly lazy load things. There are a bunch of these different cases, and so I think you can boil them down to a couple things like for instance, grabbing a model from the server and passing it to the controller. And so I want to come up with steps in these pipelines that accurately reflect those use cases, so it's not confusing, right? Like you don't have this giant API space that's super powerful that you can do everything. It's much more easy to find the way to do what you want to. That being said, you still have total control over the pipeline. You can still go in there and reconfigure it. You can add your own steps. So in that sense, yes, you get resolves that way, right? So to, I guess, explain a little bit further, what happens is when you try and navigate somewhere, first the router parses this information based on the configuration that it has, and then it passes this information called an instruction through each one of these steps. And the last step being update all of the outlets in your app. So you could add your own one there that does whatever you want. That would be kind of like a resolve block. But I really want to have a more fine-grained API for the common cases.
There's one over here.
Hi, I've used the UI router, and I've used it with as a state machine and not associated with a path or a URL. So I've been interested in doing that, and wondering if I can continue to do that in the future.
I'm still working on exactly what it looks like to have states that don't have a URL. I'm curious what your use case is actually, because I have some solutions in mind, but I actually would like to hear more, because this is something I've gotten a lot of questions about, but the use cases are so varied that it's been difficult to come up with this is how it works in the router land.
Well, I guess it's sort of like I have maybe any number of components on a page, and they're all in a different state. The simple example is like an edit state versus preview state. So all these different components could be in different states. I mean, it may be that I'm just after a generic state machine, and that I shouldn't, go on using UI router, but it's sort of there. I started using it.
But I guess the question is like, the URLs change those like
Right, because there's like say 20 of them on a page, and the URL can't really reflect the various states of all 20 components on the page.
I see. Yeah, so there are all sorts of strategies for dealing with this. One of them might be that in this particular case, you have your own parent component that that handles switching between these. Like I'm not sure if this is really the business of the router to be like controlling different things that are unrelated to the URL. Do they create like history changes? Like, is the idea to preserve the back button there?
That would be ideal. But like I said before, it's possible that I'm going down the wrong tree as far as using UI router to do this type of thing. It does let me do it, but I'm not sure if it's the right path.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure either. I think the best thing for you to do would actually be to follow up on GitHub on Angular/router and just file an issue describing your use case. If you're curious, there's a bunch of issues similar with a label use case, and they just describe things that people want to do and their motivations, and we can have a good discussion there, I think. But it's too hard for me to say, and there's lots of hypotheticals. But pinning it down there would be the best way to answer your question, I think.
I'm still just trying to get my head around the router stuff. So I'm working on this project where I understand the router working within the single page app and getting you from part to part and those and changing the scene. What if you're dealing with a very large product line? So you have multiple projects, kind of thinking if you have multiple single page apps that you want to be able to route between. Is there a way to do that simply, or they want to have one base that kind of hosts everything and that loads different applications based on what the route is?
Yes, this is actually exactly the sort of thing that I hope to accomplish with the component router. So one cool thing is that you can essentially mount any component anywhere. So you could have totally independent teams working on different applications, and you could just mount all of them on some top level thing. As far as having different single page applications, meaning you have, index1.html and index2.html, and they're totally separate apps, and you want to link between them. That's not something right now that I have a good understanding of, but one thing that you could do is, because all of the information about these routes is in these annotations, you could develop a tool that would give you the information about all of the applications, and then from there you could determine what the URLs would be. Because all this information is statically available, so you could figure it out. You might need to do some tooling because this is kind of a strange case, but again, perhaps you should file an issue on GitHub, and we can talk about it a little bit more there. I think the answer is yes, the component router will be able to meet these needs, and if not, I'm happy to point you in the right direction for how you can build some things on top of the component router to do everything. Do you guys have any questions about like Angular 2 itself? I made Rado come sit with
It's
me.
all right. It's been very educational.
I had one quick question on sort of ng route and how you lay out your routes in ng route and what you were describing as far as the component router. So on the application I'm working on, a lot of people don't necessarily specify the controller as part of the route. They just specify the template, and then inside the template, they specify the controller. So I was just curious if you could just talk, generally speaking, to how component router, whether or not it seemed like you were trying to widgetize the whole component to be used so that, to promote reuse rather than specifying the controller in the template. So I guess I was just curious if that sort of jives, is that sort of along the right lines of thinking that?
Yeah, like my generic answer for anyone that has kind of a special style that they've been using is that you'll be able to configure somehow in this component mapper how to deal with this. So in your case, what I would do is I would map to a controller that does nothing, essentially, a no-op controller, and then I would let the compiler find the ng controller tag inside there and instantiate it. And that would be a good way to get onto component router. From there, you could slowly start updating your code and moving it so it's organized in sort of the recommended way. But as kind of a solution in the meantime, configuring this component mapper is the way to solve your issue.
Okay, we have another one from the site. Is there any chance that Angular 2 components will provide any sort of DOM CSS isolation as does Web Components Polymer?
Ooh, that's a good one for Rado.
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Is there any chance that Angular 2 components will provide any sort of DOM CSS isolation as does Web Components Polymer?
Yeah, so basically every component, when it gets instantiated, it brings its template into the DOM, and the mechanism it uses is configurable. So by default, we'll be shimming the shadow DOM spec, which provides the CSS isolation and the DOM isolation. And if you're targeting browsers that support the shadow DOM APIs, you can turn it on and directly use the shadow DOM APIs just like Polymer. So basically, we're sharing the APIs that are underneath Polymer, and you can get exactly the same benefits that you get from Polymer components. And it's configurable by default. We are shimming because most users will be targeting browsers that do not have shadow DOM. But if you're only targeting Chrome, let's say, you can turn it on.
So just a question, this is Jeff. I thought when I was looking at code that in the emulation mode, it doesn't actually create isolation, right? Like if you create like a CSS class named blah in one component and blah in another component, it gets pushed to the style in the head, right? So like it'll overwrite each other. Is that correct?
No, that does. They wouldn't be overwriting each other. That sounds like a bug. Is that your experience with our current alpha? It could be possible. It's possible that maybe in the alpha it's like that, and we can follow up.
I thought it seemed like in emulation mode it wasn't actually isolating the CSS styles first.
Oh, so let's say that's right. We have 4 different modes. So the mode that's default right now does not provide CSS emulation, because the emulation by itself might be heavy and might not be what some users have. So that's just the default option. That's because some people might have, let's say, Bootstrap on top of their page, and then they want to use the Bootstrap styles within their components, so they do not want CSS emulation. So that's the default. By using the dependency injection and rebinding, we have the other mode, which is the shimmed mode with CSS emulation, which does actually provide the CSS isolation emulation. It's a mouthful. And we have the native mode where you would just use the Shadow DOM if it's available.
Okay, that makes sense.
So what you've seen is the default, but we do have all the 3 options to choose from. And if you're playing with Angular 2 right now with Alpha, take a look at Shadow DOM strategy, which is the class which supports the different modes.
Got it. Okay.
Cool. So I have about 5 more minutes for questions. Just an FYI.
Oh, yeah, one over.
So this is an Angular 2 related question and Angular material. So Angular material, I noticed it's scoring 0.8. What are the plans to make it more complete and kind of competing with Bootstrap UI?
We don't have expertise, the 2 of us, in the material design space. So unfortunately,
Grab Jeremy.
Grab Jeremy. Okay, you'll grab Jeremy.
Impromptu.
Okay, let's queue up another question. But yeah, we'll grab someone that knows the answer.
So I have one filler since most of us right now. So Brian, Brad mentioned that at NG Health that around May or June they were going to have a team within Angular start one of the teams that use Angular for an actual product start to build one of their apps in Angular 2 as kind of a showcase. Is that still on track, or what's happening there?
Yeah, that's actually why I have so little time these days. It's great. They've been kind of informing, what things need fixing, where bugs are. But yeah, that's just chugging along. So as far as I know, that time frame is still okay. Okay, here we have Jeremy, who is an expert on Angular material, and will answer the previous question.
Okay, what was the question?
So the question again is, I noticed that now it's 0.8, and it's still growing, and it's not quite, it doesn't seem quite complete. So a lot of people still use Bootstrap UI instead, which is not really compatible with 1.3, etc. So what are the plans to make it part of kind of core material, core Angular, and growing the amount of components in there?
Okay, so the current version for Angular material is 0.9 something, which means that it is true that we haven't really gotten to the stable 1.0 release yet. It's still a work in progress. The idea is that no guarantees, but sometimes later in the year we would have later this year, either probably summer, maybe fall, but again, no guarantees. The 1.0 version that would be sufficiently polished and bug-free that we would be willing to call it a 1.0. And when it comes to Angular 2, actually the components are going to be much more coming along with the framework. So I'm currently working on material design components for Angular 2 as the framework is developing. So those will be a little bit closer together. Did that answer the question?
I think that.
All right, I got time for like one more super quick question, and then I gotta run.
Super quick? Anybody?
Like yes or no question, ideally. If I can respond in binary, that'd be great.
I think we're good. Any other questions we can bring to GitHub and put them on the repo for you.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm also on the Twitters and other places too, so you can find me and bug me. Thanks for giving me the chance to talk about things. It was fun.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I gotta go now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.